Hi. So today we are going to start with the first session of income tax and the first chapter of income tax, that is residential status. But before starting the chapter, let's understand what is residential status or why we need to determine the residential status. So basically, the incidence of a tax for an assessee is based on his residential status of the previous year, which means whether certain income is chargeable to an assessee or taxable to an assessee or not is dependent upon his residential status. Like, let's say if a person is earning some income from the foreign country. Now, if his residential status is an ordinary resident, in that case that will be chargeable to him. If his residential status is not ordinary residential or non-resident, in that case it would be exempt to him. We will understand each and every aspect in detail as we will proceed with the chapter. One more thing, many of the time students combine residential status with the citizenship. But let's understand, being a citizen is completely different thing and being a resident is also a completely different thing. We will understand how to determine the residential status of a person, rather of an individual, in this particular session. So let's start. So when I say residential status, there will be mainly three kinds of status. One, a person can either be an ordinary resident, or the person can be a non-resident, or there is one more category, that is a person can be a resident but not an ordinary resident. If I say mainly there are two parts, one is resident and one is non-resident, but under the part of resident there are two subparts, one is ordinary resident and one is resident but not an ordinary resident. So how to determine the residential status of a person? Let's understand that. So basically there are mainly two conditions given. The first condition is a person has to stay in India in the previous year for the time period of 182 days or more, which means in the previous year a person has to stay in India for the time period of at least 182 days. It is not compulsory that the person has to stay for the continuous period of 182 days, but it can be in the parts also. So a person came to India, he went out of India, he again came to India in previous year, that is also allowed in this year. But if a person is not able to stay in India for 182 days or more, in that case, would he be considered as a non-resident? No, sir. If he is not able to stay in India for 182 days or more, in that case, there is an additional condition also given. So, let's say if a person is able to stay in India for 182 days or more, he is resident. But if he is not able to stay in India for 182 days or more, in that case, there are two additional conditions given to him. First, he has to stay in India for immediately 4 preceding years in 365 days or more, and he has to stay in India for 60 days or more in the relevant financial year. Sounds a bit tricky. Let me elaborate to you. So when I say a person has to stay in India for 365 days in 4 preceding previous year, which means 4 years not including of previous year, rather 4 years before previous year. So when I am calculating 182 days, in that case I need to calculate previous year only. So if I am doing calculation for the assessment year 1920, 182 days will be determined for the year 1819. However, 365 days in total would not include 1819. Rather, that would be 1718, 1617, 1516 and 1415. And in those 4 years combined, he has to stay in India for at least 365 days. With that, he also needs to fulfill an additional condition that he has to stay in India for 60 days in the previous year. So here, if you are not able to fulfill the condition of 182 days, in that case, if you want to be resident, you need to fulfill two conditions simultaneously. Condition number 1, in the previous year, you need to stay in India for 60 days or more. And second condition, you need to be in India for 365 days or more in the previous year preceding to, in 4 years preceding to previous year. So there are two conditions. first 182 days, if you are not able to fulfill, you need to fulfill these two conditions simultaneously. Now, if you are able to fulfill any one of these conditions, you will be considered as a resident. But let's say you are not able to fulfill any of these conditions. In that case, you will be directly considered as a non-resident. So, if both the above given conditions are not being fulfilled, you are not able to fulfill any of the conditions, here your status is resident. I guess we are clear with how to determine whether a person is resident or a non-resident. Let's summarize. So, when I say a person, if he is able to fulfill any of above given two conditions, he will be considered as a resident. If he is not able to fulfill any of the conditions, he will be considered as a non-resident. What's next? So next, let's say if a status of a person is considered as a resident. Now in that case also, there are two sub-conditions. There are two more status. One, if a person is resident, he can be either an ordinary resident or he can be a person who is not an ordinary resident. So even though you are resident, after that you need to see whether you are an ordinary resident or you are a resident but not an ordinary resident. And what are the conditions for those? So here are the conditions for those. If you want to be an ordinary resident, first you have to be a resident. That is completely okay. And now if you are resident, you need to fulfill two more conditions. Condition number 1, a person has been resident of India for at least 2 years out of 10 immediately preceding previous years, and he has to stay in India for 730 days out of 7 immediately preceding years. So again you need to see if you are a resident, whether you are an ordinary resident or the resident but a not ordinary resident. So if I summarize one more time, a person, if he is able to fulfill the condition of 182 days, he is a resident. If he is not able to fulfill the condition of 182 days, in that case there are two more conditions given. There is a condition of 60 days and 365 days out of 4 preceding previous year. And if he is able to satisfy that condition, he will be considered as a resident. But if he is not able to consider any of the definition, he will be considered as a non-resident. Now, if a person is a resident, in that case, he can be either an ordinary resident or he can be a resident but not an ordinary resident. So, if he is able to fulfill the condition of 2 years out of 10 years, and if he is able to satisfy the condition of 730 days out of 7 years, if he is able to fulfill both the conditions, in that case he will be considered as an ordinary resident. But if he is not able to satisfy any of the condition, in that case he will be considered as a resident but not an ordinary resident. So there is one more exception which is given in that case. That is, there are two exceptions, which is given. First, an individual who lives in India in the previous financial year for the purpose of employment, and another is if an individual who is a citizen of India or a person who of an Indian origin is staying out of India and came to India to visit in the previous year. In that case, we don't need to fulfill all the conditions. In both the cases, we need to see only one condition, and that is the condition of 182 days. So, as an exception, if a person went out of India in the previous year for the purpose of employment, or if that person who is a person of a Indian origin or Indian citizen and he came to India to visit his family, in both the cases only one condition will be applicable, that is condition of 182 days. So in that case, the condition of 365 days as well as the condition of 60 days will not be applicable. So that was all about determining the residential status of an individual. Thank you.